Então, boa tarde a todos, né? Sejam bem-vindos a essa palestra do Kevin Elliott, que a gente vai ter em alguns minutos, vai começar. Antes de começar propriamente a palestra, eu gostaria de introduzir um pouquinho o trabalho do Kevin para estimular as perguntas do debate, né? Para estimular as perguntas online também. E falando das perguntas online, elas podem ser enviadas através do e-mail do IEA, que é iearesponde@usp.br, tá bem? Então, só vou falar rapidamente sobre o trabalho, a formação do Kevin, para não tomar tanto tempo dele, né? Então, o Kevin é da Michigan State University, né? Ele está vinculado ao Lyman Bryant College, o Department of Fisheries and Wildlife e o Departamento de Filosofia. Ele tem a formação em Química e Filosofia pelo Wheaton College e depois fez o doutorado em História e Filosofia da Ciência pela Universidade de Notre Dame, orientado pela Christine Schrader-Ferschett, que é uma filósofa da ciência conhecida também. As áreas de especialização do Kevin são filosofia da ciência e ética prática, mais precisamente ética ambiental e ética na pesquisa. Welcome, Kevin, and we are so happy to have you here and have a great talk.
Thank you so much, Pedro. It's really a treat to be here. It's an honor, and thank you, Pablo, for also making this possible. I also appreciate that you're letting me speak in my native language, so if I talk too quickly or am not clear, please just tell me to slow down. Thank you for letting me speak in English. Wonderful. So what I'd like to talk about today is some of the work that I've done on what you might think of as engaged philosophy of science. So I want to talk a little bit about my notion of engaged philosophy of science and then give a couple examples of different kinds of projects. So first, as I said, I'll give a little background on sort of this notion of engaged philosophy of science. As Pedro noted, a lot of my work has been on the topic of values in science, so I can't resist saying a little about that. But most of the talk will be giving a couple examples of this kind of work. So first, some work collaborating with some social scientists and natural scientists on efforts to foster diversity and inclusion in science, looking at the concept of the climate in science teams and departments and disciplines, and how that impacts underrepresented groups in science. And then I'll talk about some of the work I've done on the open science movement and the concept of open science, offering some philosophical reflections on this. So that's where I'm headed. So let me start just by saying a little about engaged philosophy of science. So now, I think this audience is probably pretty familiar with philosophy of science. I thought in case there were scientists here who aren't as familiar. Also, I've gotten the sense from Pedro that scientists in Brazil know philosophy of science better than most US scientists. But I like to introduce students to what philosophy is with this painting by Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Socrates. And, we know Socrates was so influential in Western philosophy and, irritated the leaders of Athens by going around asking big questions like, what is truth and what is virtue and justice? And so, I think of philosophy as the discipline where we get to ask these big questions. And so in philosophy of science, we ask these big picture questions about science. And so again, I think you all are very familiar with these kinds of questions. Is there a single scientific method? What are the aims of science? Can we trust current scientific theories, given that there have been big changes in science in the past? What's the nature of scientific explanation or scientific understanding? But what I've found really interesting recently, and a lot of my focus has been on thinking about questions that lend themselves to really working closely with the scientific community. And the kinds of questions that I have been really interested in is what roles should ethical and social values play in the doing of scientific research? And so I just want to give a couple examples of these kinds of questions. You all probably are familiar with Hugh Lacey, a wonderful philosopher of science with a lot of connections here in Sao Paulo. And I've really liked his work thinking about how our choices of research questions and even the strategies that we use for answering those questions can be value laden in the sense that depending on the questions we ask, it tends to advance different sorts of social values. So, Lacey highlights that, so often agricultural research focuses on this question of, how can we maximize the yield of crops? But he points out that we could be asking other sorts of questions. I have a quotation here from this International Assessment of Agricultural Science, and they encourage the question, how can we use agriculture to address social issues like poverty and rural livelihoods and development? And so asking somewhat different research questions can have very different ramifications for society. Another example of sort of thinking about how values intersect with research involves standards of evidence. The philosopher of science Heather Douglas has written on this topic, and she argues that we should really be reflecting on how our choice of how much evidence we demand before drawing conclusions, how that ends up having implications for society. So, this might involve, how many studies do we want to see before we're willing to draw a conclusion that, a chemical is toxic or that some intervention will have an effect? What kinds of studies do we demand before we're willing to draw these conclusions? And even just basically what statistical significance levels we demand in order to draw conclusions. So one of my favorite examples of this comes from the famous climate scientist Jim Hansen. In 1988, he was asked to give testimony before the US Congress. And, the modelers, pretty much agreed at that point that we would see climate change in the future. But it was much more tricky to say whether they could already see effects of climate change. And he went ahead and said, based on his modeling, he thought we could already see climate change happening. And some other climate scientists said, we're not sure it's such a good idea to actually say that to Congress. We're not so certain. And Hansen really, he operated just the way Douglas would want him to. He says he considered, what are the costs of, sort of being wrong versus the costs of not talking and saying it was already happening. And he said, it seems appropriate. We have enough evidence that I feel comfortable telling Congress that this is happening. So it just shows the kind of real world impacts of these decisions. So, I've been interested, Pedro mentioned my book. A lot of what I do in that book is to look at all these different kinds of choices in science that can be value laden in the sense that depending on how these choices are made, they can have social impacts. So, like I said, research questions, the terminology, the categories that scientists use, how they design their studies to address a question, how they develop their models, when you have ambiguous evidence, how one interprets that evidence. And like I just said with Douglas, the standards of evidence for drawing conclusions, and then how work is framed for broader audiences. So what I'd like to, so then my point here is that we've got all this interesting work that philosophers are starting to do that lends itself to sort of collaborating with scientists, interacting with them. And I've been interested in sort of how to think about different ways philosophers can do this engaged work. I think of engagement as connecting with other disciplines, with people outside of philosophy. And so I wrote a paper with Katie Plaisance, another philosopher of science, about trying to characterize different ways of doing this kind of connecting, this kind of engaged work. And we had this central kind of simple figure that we offered, suggesting that some approaches to engagement might be fairly individual, where you as an individual philosopher sort of reflect on work going on in the sciences. Others might be much more collaborative, where you're actually in social interaction with people outside of philosophy. And then some work might mainly use concepts from within philosophy, kind of that we represent that at the bottom of the figure. And then in other cases, you might take concepts from philosophy and really integrate it with concepts from other disciplines to develop new frameworks. And so we didn't want to suggest that one region of the figure is more valuable than the other. We think that all these different kinds of engagement can be valuable depending on the context. So I want to give two examples of my engaged work. One is more collaborative, working with people outside philosophy, and some of it actually integrates concepts from philosophy with other fields. And then my second example, involving open science, will be farther down, more individual, myself as an individual reflecting on work in open science. And you might also think of it as mainly using tools of philosophy and applying it. So that might be down toward the bottom left of the figure. So you get to see a couple approaches to engaged philosophy of science. So with that, let me give my first example of some work trying to think about ways to foster diversity and inclusion in science. So this is a recent report from the US National Academy of Sciences. And I want to note, I feel bad that a lot of my examples are from a US context. I hope in our question and answer session that you can really help me think about interesting examples from Brazil so that we can have a really nice international discussion. But a lot of the work on diversity in science has highlighted different reasons why it can be valuable to promote various kinds of diversity in science. Sometimes it can help teams. When you have scientific teams with various forms of diversity, they can approach problems more effectively when they have diversity. It can make science more likely to address the range of problems in society if you have people with different social identities who recognize different kinds of problems. And of course, it can improve the learning experiences for students if they can see that there are professors who share their identities, their perspectives. And it can help underrepresented groups from experiencing token effects, like say they're the only person in a scientific group with their kind of background or identity. It can be a challenge for them to feel comfortable. But this raises the question of how can we actually fully achieve these goals? How can we foster different kinds of diversity and enable people with diverse backgrounds to work effectively together? And so motivated by this question, back about 10 years ago, I joined an interdisciplinary group that wanted to look at how those who bring greater diversity to teams how they experience the climate on those teams. And I'll say more about this concept of climate. But this was kind of our sort of the image for our group. And we had on the left an environmental scientist, a historian of science, myself as a philosopher of science, another environmental scientist, and a psychologist. So a really interesting group working together on this. And so we use this concept from psychology of climate. And we surveyed over 250 scientists from about 100 different environmental science teams. So, I mentioned we were working with some environmental scientists. So we focused on environmental science teams that had been funded by our National Science Foundation. And we asked these scientists about two kinds of diversity that they might bring to these teams. One was demographic diversity, like gender, race, ethnicity. And then the other was what we call disciplinary diversity. We kind of use that to capture several things. One was like if the majority of the people on these teams were natural scientists, what was it like for people from the social sciences or the humanities on these teams? And then what was it like for, say, new members on the teams? And then we asked about their perceptions of the climate, sort of the sense of sort of what were the norms like on these teams? What was their perceptions of how people interacted together? And then also just their overall satisfaction with the teams, how they felt about the authorship practices, and so on. And so just, I won't spend much time on this slide, but just to give you a sense of what we meant by climate, psychologists think of this as the perceived norms, attitudes, and expectations on the teams. So we ask questions about like procedural justice, how people felt about, sort of how things operated on the teams in terms of communicating, in terms of influencing the practices of the teams. And then, what was the collaboration like on the team? Was it, really hierarchical, or could people work together? And how did people feel about inclusion on the team? So that's the sort of questions we asked about climate. And so, this is one main paper that came out of this collaboration. And we found that the climate on these teams, the kinds of questions I was just noting, was related to a number of outcomes. So people's overall satisfaction on the about the teams was associated with their perceptions of climate, how satisfied they were with the team's authorship practices, who got to be an author, how they ordered authors, and how they perceived the data sharing within the teams. So climate seemed to be a really significant a predictor of some of these outcomes. But the individuals who brought either more demographic diversity or the scientific diversity to the teams tended to perceive the climate more negatively. And this helped to explain their tending to have more negative perceptions of the team as a whole, and so on. So we thought this was interesting to see the role of climate in these teams. So that motivated us to pursue another project that we called Climbs Up. And so here we have some of the same people. We had our psychologist, again, an environmental scientist, or the historian of science, me. We added another sociologist, and then we had some postdocs, some in sociology and psychology, a grad student in psychology, and then some undergraduate students in the sciences. So you can see this was a very sort of social kind of engagement. I was working with lots of different people outside of the philosophy of science. And here, our goal was, okay, it seems like climate is sort of significantly associated with people's experiences. So what if the climate on research teams, and then we added the idea of the climate in departments and also in people's scholarly disciplines, would that affect younger scientists' career attitudes and outcomes? If they experienced a more positive climate, would people from underrepresented backgrounds in science be more likely to want to continue in science and feel good about a career in science? So our basic hypothesis was that for STEM scholars from underrepresented backgrounds, experiencing an inclusive climate would be related to more positive career attitudes and outcomes. So again, I won't bore you with all the details of this figure, but you can see the basic idea. We wanted to see how people who brought demographic diversity to teams, how that might be associated with their ultimate career attitudes and productivity. And then we were curious in the middle how people's experience of climate at different levels, at the research group level, and then at the organization level, the department level, and then at the professional level, like what they thought of the climate of their discipline, how that would affect their career attitudes. And so this time we were able to survey a lot more scientists. And again, we focused on earlier career researchers, doctoral students, postdoctoral scholars, and assistant professors. And instead of just environmental science, we looked at 4 different disciplines: biology, economics, physics, and psychology. So kind of a range of disciplines. And so, of course, we asked about their demographic information. We asked about their climate perceptions at these different levels. And then we asked about their career attitudes and outcomes like publications and so on. And so we haven't analyzed all the data at this point, but just the big picture is that our hypothesis does appear to be supported by the data, that we found that those with more marginalized identities demographically tended to experience a more negative climate at all those levels. And then this was associated with more negative career attitudes, like being more, having more turnover intentions, feeling more burned out. And interestingly, we found that the professional field level climate was an especially important predictor. So whether people thought of their field of physics or economics or biology as having a positive climate. So that was very interesting. But I just want to focus on one piece of this that I was more involved with. You may think, this sounds like a bunch of psychology. What does this have to do with philosophy? Well, one piece that I was especially involved in was developing a concept that we called authorship climate. So I've been interested in kind of research ethics work on sort of the ethics of how we decide when you have multiple authors, who should be first author, who should be last, how they should be ordered, who should be an author. And so we developed this concept to explore people's perceptions of this. So I see this as engaged and kind of interdisciplinary engagement. So my figure of engagement, pretty high on it, because we took work from psychology on climate and integrated it with this philosophical work from research ethics, thinking about authorship. And so we developed this definition of authorship climate that had 3 aspects to it. So thinking about how did people feel about the fairness of the process of deciding authorship? How did people feel about the communication, like how they talked about these choices about authorship? And then how did they feel about the outcome, who actually was listed as an author in what order? So we called this authorship procedural justice, how people felt about the process, authorship informational justice, about just the communication, and authorship distributive justice. So if you want to read more about this, we published this paper introducing this concept of authorship climate. I want to show you a few interesting figures from this paper, just some basic descriptions of what we found. So what we have is that on the left, we have bars representing procedural justice perceptions, then in the middle, informational justice perceptions, and then on the right, distributive justice perceptions. And then the bars we've got for doctoral students are the darkest bars, then for postdocs, and then for assistant professors. So you can see for each of these, procedural, informational, and distributive justice, the assistant professors felt the best about the authorship climate. So you can see they probably had more power in these teams. And of course, if we had included full professors, they probably would have felt really good about the authorship climate. But you can see this issue of power seems to have had an impact here. Then we also looked at how people perceived these kinds of climate depending on whether they were the lead authors on papers or non-lead authors. And in all 3 cases, the lead authors with the darker bars felt better about the climate. Once again, they had more power and control. Then this was very interesting to us. We looked at how people perceived these aspects of the climate depending on how authorship order was determined. So on the left bar in each group is ordering the authors alphabetically. I didn't realize before this that economists typically just list all the authors alphabetically. Some areas of physics will do that, whereas like the biologists and the psychologists would tend to use more of like the middle bar model, like by contribution. So, you know, the lead author would probably be first, and then maybe the senior author last, and so on. And then we also asked if they had a hybrid model, sort of some alphabetical, some by contribution. And I just want to highlight these last two groups, that actually the alphabetical ordering made people feel good about informational justice. They knew how the ordering was determined. It's just alphabetical. But they really didn't like this from a distributive justice perspective. They said you were not actually seeing our work well represented in the authorship order. And then this is my last figure. I don't do that many figures in my talks. This shows the far left bar represents people who didn't have marginalized identities. So in the US, this would be like a white, cisgender, heterosexual man without disabilities, a native English speaker. And then the middle bar would be having like one of those marginalized identities, and then the right would be two or more. And we found in each of these areas that those with two or more marginalized identities perceive the authorship climate lower. So fitting with some of our other results. And if you want, in the Q&A, we've done some other work on authorship in our project I'd be happy to talk about. But these issues of power dynamics and marginalized identities are really interesting to us. So in terms of this project, with diversity and inclusion, the take-home lessons I would offer is that the climate on science teams we found was related to a number of outcomes: satisfaction with the teams, satisfaction with authorship practices, and perceptions of the frequency of data sharing within the teams. And then with our second project, the climate, not only in the teams, but also the departments and the professional discipline, was also related to career attitudes, again, like turnover intentions and burnout. And then underrepresented groups, we're finding experience more negative climates, and this helps to explain their more negative experiences and career attitudes as a whole. So this gives possibilities for potentially intervening to see, can we make the climate more positive for those who are bringing diversity to teams? And then we would suggest that this idea of authorship climate merits further investigation. So that's one example of engaged philosophical work I've been involved with. So now I want to take us in a totally different direction. So if you didn't find that interesting, maybe you'll find open science more interesting. So, so here, just to kind of get us on the same page, this is a quotation from a National Academy of Sciences report saying open science aims to ensure the availability and the usability of scholarly publications and the data underlying them and the methodologies associated with them. And so, and actually, I'm going to sort of discuss open science even a little more broadly than that. But I want to just share briefly some of the main objectives of the open science movement, and then talk about some of the initiatives associated with open science, and then offer some philosophical reflections. So kind of a different example of engaged philosophical work connecting with trends in science. So turning to major objectives, this is a report that came out about 10 years ago from the British Royal Society, and they discuss some of these objectives. One goal is that we can speed scientific discovery and innovation if more information is openly available for everybody to access. The thought is it can promote the quality of science. So say, if we can look at the data underlying people's studies, then others can evaluate, was this actually done well? If there are concerns that people might have had conflicts of interest that influenced how they analyzed the data, we can check up on people. It can be valuable for the public and for policymakers to have access to information. And ideally, it can help to advance equity and inclusion in science. So say researchers are at a university that doesn't have as many resources, if they can get access to other people's data, they can potentially help contribute to moving science forward, even if they don't have as many resources. This is a figure from a project in the European Union. I apologize, it's a little fuzzy, but what I like is it shows the range of different practices associated with open science. So in the middle, you see what we often think of open access, having papers available without having to pay. And then like the blue hexagon, making data openly available for other researchers to access. But it also highlights in red the idea of making peer review practice maybe more open, so it's not as hidden. Possibly in purple, I'll mention the idea of open notebooks, actually making people's laboratory notebooks more available to others online to provide feedback. In orange, the idea of citizen science, having community members more involved in research. So it can really take a lot of forms, and that's why I like this figure. So I'm going to just briefly touch on some of these initiatives. I'll go quickly so we don't get bogged down. But one, of course, is open access publishing. And this is something I'm really hoping you all can give me some thoughts on in the question and answer, because my impression is that actually in the Latin American context, you're kind of ahead of the rest of the world in terms of doing this well. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on the pros and the cons of your approaches. There are major journals like the Public Library of Science and BMC that have been early on just publishing in an open access format. But, there are big initiatives like starting in Europe, Plan S, that's really been pushing for all publicly funded science to be then published so that people don't have to pay to access it. But of course, the model typically used is that then the people producing the science have to pay to publish. So we can talk more about that. And then the idea of preprint servers, where there are lots of archives now for people before their work is actually, before it's gone through peer review and published, to just put their papers on these servers for others to see. This was very prominent during COVID, trying to move quickly that people would put their papers on these servers. And then making data or code or materials available to others. I'm just giving some examples of major repositories where ICPSR is more of a social science data repository. GitHub is more for computer code. And then there are some policies also to require like privately funded work, say for regulatory purposes, to make more of that openly available, but it's still not as common as with publicly funded research, which is an issue to consider. And then there have been principles developed for deciding how to handle openly accessible data. So some really influential principles are the FAIR principles, F for findable, A for accessible, I for interoperable, and R for reusable. So scientists are trying to sort of make their data available so that then like machine learning algorithms can access lots of data and work with it. Also, there are moves to require or encourage more scientists to pre-register their studies, to put, for example, in the biomedical context, to report if they're doing a clinical trial, to say, here's what we're planning to do, both the fact that the study will be done and how it will be done. So then they're less likely afterwards, if they don't like the results, to just hide them or change how they analyze them. So the hope is to make research more reliable. And this is starting to happen more in the social sciences, in psychology as well. So there's some work at the Center for Open Science at the University of Virginia has really been pushing some of this in the social sciences. And then I mentioned earlier the idea of open lab notebooks. I haven't heard of lots of labs doing this, but it's very interesting. In principle, if we want the best science and we want to be really collaborative, the idea of sharing with others what one is planning to do and then seeing what other people think about it, getting their advice, this would be a really good way to do science, much less competitive, perhaps. And then I mentioned the idea of open peer review. So this is a paper that highlights different kinds of approaches to making peer review more open. So one, I know it's kind of hard to see. The first line is just being more open about the identities of who the authors are and who the peer reviewers are. Then the second idea is to have the peer review reports be more open. So perhaps to publish the peer review reports alongside the articles. The next is open participation, maybe making it easier for the broader community to provide comments on papers where they're published. So, again, I won't go through the details, but interesting thoughts. You can imagine pros and cons of this, I'm sure. And then the idea of community participation in research. I've found very helpful for teaching purposes a set of videos at this website, The Crowd and the Cloud, where they've created many video vignettes of different projects where community members are collaborating with the scientists on projects. There's a big list of these kinds of projects at this website, citizenscience.gov, and so on. So with that, just a sense of the range of forms that open science can take, I want to offer just a few philosophical reflections, and then you've almost survived my talk. I'll be done soon, and then we can have fun discussing. So first, so again, trying to do engaged work, reflecting on these trends in science, I've suggested that when we talk about openness or transparency in science, that these concepts are ambiguous, and it would really be helpful to clarify the senses in which we're using these. Also, once we think more about different forms of openness, it's helpful to think that it's not just about releasing information into the world, but how are we making this information accessible and intelligible and usable for different kinds of audiences? So I want to talk a little about that. And then finally, openness sounds good, but it can also have some drawbacks, and it's important to keep those in mind and think about what forms of openness make sense, what forms are problematic, and how to ease the potential drawbacks. Okay, so thinking first about this idea that openness is ambiguous. So I published a paper a while ago trying to clarify different concepts of transparency or openness. I'm thinking about these concepts as largely synonymous here. So say we try to think more about what exactly are we trying to be open about? Are we focusing on being open about data? Are we focusing on being open about the methods that we used? Are we focusing on openness about code or about the materials that were used, the procedures? We might also, even before a lot of the open science movement as a whole, people were realizing in some areas, maybe we at least need openness about conflicts of interest. Who's funding this research? Who has interests in it? For philosophers of science, we're often interested in what are the values underlying this research. Are there ways to help the scientists be more open about that, or about the value implications of the research? Sometimes there may be, like with some reports, deliberations in the background. Maybe we want openness about those deliberations. Again, for philosophers of science, we're often interested in the background assumptions behind research. Are there ways to make those more open? So, what exactly are we trying to be transparent or open about? I think is a really interesting question. And then similarly, it's not just the content that can vary, but as I discuss in this paper, well, what audience are we trying to be open or transparent to? We may be transparent to some other scientists, but the general public may not find our disclosure very transparent. Are we wanting to be open right at the beginning of our studies, or is it just after they're all finished that we want to, make like data available? How are we going about doing this? In what form are we providing this information? Who is providing this information? And so on. So I offered this figure pointing out that when we're thinking about openness or transparency, we need to ask, well, what's our goal? What are we trying to achieve? And then that may influence who our audience is. Who do we want to be open to? And then what content are we trying to provide that audience? And then how are we providing that content? Over what time? Who's providing the information, in what venue, and so on. And then we need to keep thinking in the background, what are the potential dangers of all these choices? So don't get scared by this crazy table here. My main point is just pointing out that each group is one of those categories, like the purpose for transparency, or the audience, or the content, or the time frame. And I have all these bullet points to show all the different forms that this can take. So you suddenly realize, wow, transparency is actually a pretty complicated concept. It can take a lot of different forms. So then that leads to the issue of, well, if we're trying to be open with our science in ways that make it accessible or usable or intelligible, well, what's the audience we're gearing this toward? How are we actually going to make this information available? And so, I think that the scientific community tends to be the focus of a lot of our open science initiatives, but we might think about, how can we be open in meaningful ways for regulators, for policymakers, for community members who are concerned about pollution or some other issue, just for general members of the public. And so in this paper I wrote with David Resnick, we said we were kind of worried that the most common approaches to open science, where we're just making papers openly accessible or putting the data underlying a study in a database, that this doesn't really help community members. I can't make sense of the data in these databases. And so we asked, what would we need to do to make science open in a way that's actually meaningful to other groups that aren't specialists? And so, we just pointed to a few interesting examples in this paper. One example that I enjoyed learning about is the US NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, has all this data that is available to people, but most of us would have no idea how to use it. And so, to help communities that were concerned about air pollution and other air quality issues, they created these teams of academics who said they would be willing to work with communities who had questions to use the data. So it creates these intermediaries who can help actually take this openly accessible information and actually make it usable for communities. NASA has another project with USAID to help governments around the world who are concerned about flooding risks or other environmental threats to use this NASA data. So again, it's not just putting the data out there, but actually finding ways to use it to answer questions. And so I thought this was really interesting. Also, back to the idea of community involvement, I think that often NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or other community groups, when they get involved in research, they often help to make the results available in ways that are more meaningful and that can help people take action, engage in activism. So this is an example from Oakland, California, kind of in the San Francisco Bay area, where they have a lot of pollution concerns. And so this was a website they created to help different community groups upload information about air quality, and then they can also access information there. And again, I could talk about more examples in the question and answer session, I think it's really interesting to think about how these other groups can help make scientific information available in ways that just ordinary people can potentially use. Okay, so I turn to the last spot here, potential drawbacks. How can openness get us into trouble? And here I want to talk about several briefly, and then we can talk more about whatever's most interesting to you. One is it can potentially inhibit epistemic diversity by imposing particular standards for like how the information is presented in databases and so on. Sabina Leonelli, if you're familiar with her, has done really nice work on open science and has been thinking about this. She's at the University of Exeter in the UK. It can also disadvantage those with fewer resources to contribute to or access or make use of the information. So I said at the beginning, ideally, open science is supposed to help make information more equitable, but ironically, it can sometimes actually complicate these efforts. So I want to note that. And then sometimes information can be disclosed in ways that cause harm. So I'll just touch on each of these three, and then we'll be finished. So in terms of inhibiting epistemic diversity, this is from a poster that was presented at the last Philosophy of Science Association meeting by Beckett Sterner and Steve Elliott. They're at Arizona State University. And what they point out is, say we're dealing with data about different species, maybe endangered species, threatened species. Often you'll have groups using non-standard taxonomies, especially say you have indigenous groups or those with local knowledge collecting information. But then the repositories for this information, say an open science repository, probably uses a standardized taxonomy. And that can be helpful, then everybody is using the same format, but it has costs for those using the non-standard taxonomies, trying to translate that information over, having to go to that effort to kind of be multilingual in a sense, and we may lose some of the information in the non-standard taxonomy. So it's worth thinking about how these sort of open science can create a rigidity that can be problematic at times. And then to the point about how it can disadvantage those with fewer resources. So during the pandemic, various scientific groups were saying we really need everybody to provide their COVID genome data for various variants of the virus and make this totally available with no restrictions. That will move the science forward faster. But various groups, especially from the global south, said there are real costs to doing this for us because we may spend a lot of time and effort collecting this information. You want us to make this totally accessible to everyone, use up all our time, and then it may be that big corporations from the global north or other folks develop various cures or vaccines with this, and then it may not be so accessible to us in the global south, and we may not be getting as much credit for all that time we put into this work. So it just highlights these issues that even though it sounds great to make all of this openly available, some people may be more advantaged than others. Also, on this point, back to this issue of how we engage in open access publication, the model that we typically have in the global north of sort of making the scientists themselves pay the open access sort of fee to publish so that then everybody else can freely access it. If you have scientists without as much money to pay, that's a disadvantage. And I thank Pedro for pointing me to this really interesting post from some administrators here at the University of Sao Paulo, pointing out that some journals will say, hey, we provide waivers to low-income countries, so their researchers don't have to pay. And lower middle-income countries, they don't have to pay as much. But as some of these folks here at the university pointed out, for middle income countries, it can still be a challenge, a real drain to pay on really expensive fees. And of course, if you're in the humanities like me, you can probably appreciate it's often hard to get money to pay these kinds of, for this kind of open access model. So then finally, I just wanted to point out the worry that disclosing information can sometimes cause harm. If you're disclosing information about people's private medical records or local communities, indigenous communities, and most data sharing principles that get discussed, like the FAIR principles I mentioned earlier, they don't really address these ethical issues. This is a commentary on the FAIR principles, and they say what these principles are really designed to do is to help machines, to say, let's make information available so these machine learning algorithms and other tools can work through all this data. But these principles don't really focus on ethics, privacy, reproducibility, these kinds of issues. And so it's worth thinking about what kinds of principles would be better for this. And just one example, some researchers developed what they called the CARE principles that could help to think more about ethics. So these principles are specifically designed for working with data from indigenous groups. And it's in this paper, and the C stands for collective benefit, the A for authority to control, the R for responsibility, and the E for ethics. And so it highlights different questions or issues to think about for if one's working with data from more vulnerable communities. How should you decide how open you are with the data, in what formats, and so on. Okay, so the take-home lessons from this second project on open science is, there are a lot of exciting aspects of the open science movement. It has great goals, but we need to remember that it's a complex enterprise that incorporates lots of different initiatives. And philosophers can help contribute to doing this better. We can point out the messiness of the very concept of openness or transparency. We can help, give the scientists advice on, sort of how to make this information available to different audiences in meaningful ways. We can point out some of the disadvantages, worries about epistemic diversity, worries about those with fewer resources, worries about how it can potentially cause harm in various ways. So, bringing the whole talk together, reminding you of what happened way back at the beginning, I started by saying I think it's exciting to think about engaged philosophy of science, ways of really connecting with those in the sciences. And I'm especially interested in work on thinking about how scientific work is value laden, how these choices that go into science can have these social consequences. So I know I didn't talk a lot about that, but I'm super interested in it. So any questions, I'd love to talk. And then, I gave an example of this engaged work where I was really socially interacting with people outside of philosophy, thinking about how we can foster perhaps more diversity in science by thinking about the climate in science teams. And I talked about my work in Authorship Climate. And then sort of a different kind of project where I've largely done this on my own with some other philosophers, but thinking about the open science movement and how philosophy can help to make that more effective and highlight concerns. So I just want to thank some of the funding for this project from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm so grateful to Pedro and to Pablo for making this possible. Like I said, it's a real privilege to be able to come to Sao Paulo and talk with you. And I just put up a few topics possibly for conversation during our Q&A. We can talk about engaged work. We can talk about values in science, some of this work on climate, efforts to foster diversity and inclusion in STEM, open science, or anything else that you think would be fun to talk about. I'm really excited to learn more from your experiences here and your thoughts. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Kevin, for this amazing talk. I guess we can talk. I can speak for all that. We really appreciate it. So now we have some special time for questions and answers, and also for the virtual audience, I need to speak in Portuguese. So, uh, se você quiser mandar uma pergunta para quem está assistindo online, por favor, mande no e-mail iearesponde@usp.br. So in the online chat, we have already the first question, but let's give priority to the people that are here first. So who would like to start? Renato?
Hi, Kevin. Amazing talk. I work with philosophy of probability, and I'm very interested in topics like inductive risk. So I've read your books, the collections you have edited, and I will make a point, just a joke, and another question. About authorship and order, perhaps one suggestion is to the word the word has how can I say search here? Yes,
I
make a
wondered if
lottery.
you would say
make
that,
a
yes.
lottery.
Yes. Well, it's super interesting because there is some work suggesting that all the time that scientists put into evaluating grant proposals that and often the reviews aren't that reliable, that we might be better off just using a lottery for some of these grant proposals. So yes, that's a funny point.
And the long run it will work for the community, for the entire community. In the long run, the chances.
Yes.
And the second, not exactly a question, but I would like to listen to you about affirmative actions in graduate course, not undergraduate course, but here in Brazil there are some initiatives in this side. I'd like to listen to you about this question.
That's a great point. And you may have followed in the US, there have been a lot of discussions about affirmative action recently because the US Supreme Court just limited the extent to which affirmative action can be used. Although, again, I'm not a legal scholar, but my impression is that students can still highlight the ways in which their unique backgrounds, make them particularly good candidates. Maybe they overcame certain kinds of adversity or so on. So it'll be very interesting to see how that actually plays out. And then, of course, there are moves to say, well, if we can't engage in affirmative action for those from, say, different racial groups, well, maybe the universities shouldn't engage in what is essentially affirmative action for wealthy people whose families went to the universities. I actually forget the exact term. Oh, it's called legacy admissions. So if your parents and grandparents went to Harvard, then you've got a better chance. So some universities are realizing maybe that's not too cool. Anyway, but as far as for graduate program or postgraduate, I think I would go back to my point about how a lot of times science is done better or is more meaningful if you have people from different backgrounds and identities. A fascinating example I found was the National Institutes of Health in the US is the major funder of medical research in the United States. And they were finding that Black investigators tended to be receiving like fewer grants percentage-wise than whites. And so they were trying to figure out what's going on. Is there some subtle bias here, or people recognizing names or something? And they ended up finding that one of the factors is that the Black investigators were more likely to propose projects that were very community engaged, like, sort of working with communities to identify pollution in their areas, wanting to, sort of address these very practical issues. And just in general, the reviewers tended to not like those kinds of projects. They wanted to, fund very theoretical genetic research. And so, there was this correlation between these people's backgrounds and the kinds of projects they were proposing. And so I think that's an example of how we can really have like better, more innovative science if we, sort of are willing to say, hey, we're missing some groups in society. We need more of that. So that would be one thought in response to your question. Thank you.
Okay.
Was you see another question? Yeah.
Hi, I have a lot of experience with climate culture analysis in companies, and from what I always see is that the discontents are in two categories. Or there's not the very good employees, and they're discontent by a lot of factors, and it's reflected in the surveys. Or there's stellar employees that have a different strategy or goals that they want to see the company going, and that's why they reflect their negative review in the climate. Did you control for that in the analysis that you did?
Yeah, I really wish that I had my psychology colleagues here because they really did the data analysis on this. My understanding is that when they did their analysis, they were controlling for all these other kinds of factors. Now, in terms of like, I don't know. If they would have been able to control for like how good the people were, that sort of thing.
Put them on a curve and see.
So that is a really interesting point. There could be some of these confounding factors that could play a role. I mean, I would note it was striking to me. I didn't really emphasize this, but a lot of these associations were at a very high level of statistical significance. We had like 3 asterisks, that would be 0.001. And of course, there could still be confounding factors related to that, but these were pretty strong effects that we were seeing. But you make a great point. It would be interesting to consider, what are some of these other things that.
Because if it's a small group, the small sample, it's going to be a big statistical difference because this cluster here is bigger than the other in their variation of the surface.
That's a great point. And I think with our second study, there we did have a really large, well, to me as a philosopher, it seemed large, like 3,500 scientists. The first group was only 250. So yeah, no, I appreciate your point.
Not valid.
Hi. So I found it pretty interesting to see values as something in open science to think about regarding open science. And for me, it was I'm not very familiar with this topic. So for me, open science was more about publishing openness. So I'd like to hear more from you about this idea of somehow disclosing or a more transparency regarding values in science. It's a bit complicated thing, I guess, because we are like not even open to the very idea of the presence of values in science. So it seems even more complicated to eventually open values. So I'd like to hear.
Thank you so much for that question. You kind of hit on a hot button topic for me because, there's all this philosophical work now on saying, hey, a lot of science is value laden. But then the question is, well, what do we do about this? How do we manage this? We don't want to say just, hey, any influences of values in science are great. Politically you like some outcome, so you just say it. So we need to figure out, so a lot of the work in values in science right now is trying to say, okay, what are legitimate influences of values? What are illegitimate influences? And like you mentioned, you're interested in inductive risk. One proposal that Heather Douglas made was that, well, maybe it's okay to bring values in when we're just setting our standards of evidence, like how much evidence we want, but we shouldn't bring values in like as evidence. So first you decide how much evidence there is, and then you use your values to say, okay, is this enough to draw a conclusion? Others have said, well, that may not be totally adequate, that approach. So one of the approaches I've been interested in is saying, well, maybe, and I say we need actually multiple approaches. I don't think there's a simple answer, but one thing I like to see is more transparency of various sorts. So that's why I got interested in that article. I realized, well, I'm saying that maybe we should be more transparent about the value influences on our science, but this actually gets really complicated because I was thinking, well, you could say we want the scientists to just directly disclose their values. So in some social science research, there is sort of a trend to have kind of a more of a personal statement saying, this is my identity, this is where I'm coming from. So that could be one kind of transparency. But I'm kind of worried that a lot of times the scientists wouldn't even recognize their values. We don't know what's happening. And so I ended up realizing maybe part of what we just want is enough openness about data and methods and the analysis so that then people can see, oh, you made these methodological choices that could have these consequences. Even if you didn't realize you were making these assumptions, we can then evaluate and challenge. And so, of course, you may be familiar with Helen Longino. Pedro said she's come here to speak. So she would say, it's really important to recognize the background assumptions that may influence how somebody interpreted their evidence. And this is back actually to the one reason we need a diverse scientific community to have people with these different backgrounds to challenge different background assumptions. So anyway, so that's another kind of transparency. It's not being explicit about the values, but others can maybe recognize the influences of values. And others have, sort of challenged me and made some very good points about the limitations of this kind of transparency. For one thing, if you have already done the research, sometimes you invested a whole bunch of money in doing research a particular way. It sort of privileges some values versus others. Like Lacey would say, you did all your work based on certain research questions. Then even if there's a kind of transparency, there may not be resources to do the studies a different way, or sometimes it may be possible to reanalyze the data, based on different assumptions. Other times it may not be so possible, we can't always expect other scientists to actually scrutinize everything, and study. So I sorry, this is a long answer, but the point is, it's a great point, and there's a lot to be said about how effective transparency really can be for addressing these issues of values. And I'm super interested in these questions. So if you want to talk more, I'm always happy to engage. You can Google me and email me and we can talk.
Yeah, I want to talk about a little bit about, for example, the University of Brasilia. The University of Brasilia put a program on indigenous people. So they have a special a program to graduate them. They make first the undergraduation and then they will work in graduate studies in this program. One of the problems of this program is, let us say, it's a kind of different regime, epistemological regime. The indigenous people, they complain that they are being forced on a new conception that is not their conception. No, for example, it is repeated that this sound okay, this hypothesis or this data that you are giving, but he says, I need to dream about this. I need to dream about this and to speak with the elements of nature to see if this makes sense. So it's and this is put it as it's a problem. No, that the complaint is that we have not an epistemological justice. It's the relation is certain kind of unjust, no, because science has a very epistemological idea of what are the data, what is the relation of the data with the hypothesis, what kind of hypothesis you can make.
Yes.
And this is one of the problems of in the relation with the students. It's in this dialogue between science, scientific knowledge, and the knowings, the Indian knowers.
Oh, that's such an interesting case. Yeah, you're giving me a tough one but yeah, I think so. So a couple thoughts. So one is one of the things that I hope over time that work in values and science can help with is at least to characterize the different like sort of aspects of science where you can have these different sort of, as you pointed out, regimes or approaches. So we can at least characterize what's going on. So are there differences in assumptions about the kinds of questions to ask? Or is this a difference in thinking about how to interpret evidence? Or a difference in thinking about how we frame information or so on? So we can at least better understand what's happening. And then I've just been reading some work by Charbel Ohani, a wonderful philosopher and biologist here, and I found his work with David Ludwig very interesting, talking about like partial overlaps between sort of knowledge systems or regimes. And so I think at least another step can be to clarify, okay, what are the similarities between the dominant scientific conception and these indigenous ways of knowing? And then what are the differences? And then it gets really tough, I think, trying to decide when you've got those differences, what do you do? And maybe, to some extent we can sort of explore, both approaches. And then, maybe in some cases we have to make some kind of normative claims like, well, maybe one approach is better than another for certain purposes and particular contexts. But I do think that if we want to foster diversity and inclusion, one of the things, and I want to read more, but the psychologist I've been collaborating with, her name is Isis Settles, and she's been collaborating with some other philosophers on the concept of epistemic exclusion, the ways in which disciplines exclude other perspectives. And so if we want to foster a more positive, open climate in disciplines, I think we need to be really cautious about saying, look, this is the way it's done, this is the way it's always been done, you have to do it this way. If we can offer some openness to say, okay, let's just sort of see how things work in these different areas. In the US, and again, sorry, I'm just blabbing away. Hopefully some of this is useful. In the US, an interesting example that we've had is people who want to teach creation science or intelligent design, kind of challenging evolutionary theory. And I think my thoughts on that has been, I would rather not just say, look, those can't be science. That's just, by definition, not science. But to say, hey, if you want to make some of those assumptions and see how it goes, try it. So far, it hasn't worked. It doesn't seem like it's been very fruitful. So when we're teaching students in high school, we probably don't want to, make this a major emphasis. But maybe we can at least say, we're not going to say just immediately this can't be done. So those are a few thoughts. I'd love to hear others' thoughts on those issues because it's a great case.
Hi, Kevin. I'm Vinicius. I'm a undergraduate student here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming.
and I'm from the biological science course,
Okay.
and I'm currently involved in a research group that research the epistemological of science teaching.
Ah, yeah.
And well, there are some things I want to talk about how I experienced it. Some of the things you talked about.
Wonderful.
That in a way, I think we are doing this. I think.
Okay. Cool.
I think so.
Cool.
And well, there was a case in our group that one member sent her article to be published,
Mhm.
and we got back like a horrible response.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. And he practically said that she should change the entire article, like everything, the question, the major question, everything. And we had like 5 reunions to talk about these topics in a group of 15 people. And why are we why should she change this? Does it make sense to us as a research group? I think, and I think it links a lot with the open peer reviews.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
and I think in other ways we also do the open lab notebooks. I think that the science teaching area is not as glamorous as like people finding the cure of cancer. I think it's not as glamorous as it is, but we have like some incredible laboratories here and in other universities in the city of São Paulo, like UFMC, the Federal University of the ABC.
Okay. Yes, I was hearing about that.
Yeah. And we have some incredible labs there and here, and we talk a lot with them, and they talk a lot with us, and we have like a huge network of what are we doing in science teaching to kind of link all of this. And I think we're kind of doing this, and I took a lot of notes, and I'm not understanding any of that.
Yeah.
But we, what I also wanted to say is, you talked about the authorship climate. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you talked about a lot of showing us those
Yeah. Would it be helpful to? Yeah. Maybe they can help me get it back up.
I think by creating such a environment where we do a peer review with much more open to everyone, and doing this open lab notebook, and doing this open science using data from UFABC and others groups of research, I think we kind of deal with this authorship climate in a way that the like this would not happen so much, I think, in our group.
Yeah.
Because we link these things in a more transparency way, I think.
Yeah. Well, so you've just brought up a bunch of things. I was taking notes because I was like, oh, I wanted to comment on that and this and so on. So
I just want to say
yeah, please.
Thank you. That's my first time actually asking someone in English.
Well, I keep being so impressed by everybody's English. You know, it would be a disaster if I tried to speak in Portuguese. So I'm so impressed with all of you. Thank you for communicating with me this way. Anyway, so I really like some of the points you make with say what your lab group is like, because I didn't really get a chance to talk about sort of how can we improve authorship climate? How can we make this better? And so one of the things we've suggested is to sort of have authorship policies within teams to actually say, okay, here's in general how we approach, who's going to be an author on a paper, and how we're going to order. And then people can talk about particular papers as early on as possible. And one thing we point out, so in some of our earlier work, we found that sometimes those with kind of less power on teams, like maybe postdocs, they are often under a lot of pressure to get publications so they can try to get jobs. But then it could be that the principal investigators in their labs want to put all kinds of other people as authors on the publications. And sometimes when we did interviews with people, they said, yeah, it's kind of unfortunate. It was mainly me and like 2 other people that did all the work. And then we ended up with 8 people listed on this publication, and it kind of diluted how much, sort of we felt like how much credit we got. And so sort of having policies for, who does everybody in the lab end up as an author? Like when you were mentioning how everybody sat down and had a discussion, some labs might feel like in order to be inclusive, if everybody is kind of involved in talking about the paper, maybe they should all be authors. But others might feel like, well, maybe that's just part of being part of a lab. The authors should just be the ones who are actually writing or, heavily editing. So having policies for this. And also, I think that it's really valuable for journals to have author contribution statements. And even if the journal doesn't require it, for people to actually just have a statement saying, these are the people who did the writing, these are the people who collected the data, and so on. So it's clearer. And even then, when, say, in the US, Pedro was saying it might be a little different in Brazil, but in the US, there can be so much pressure going up for tenure to have enough papers and so on. So then people can establish, look, this is how much work I did on these papers, especially in economics. Say it's just alphabetical to be able to establish I was crucial for these papers, even though I was the 4th author. Okay, so sorry, I'm blabbing away, but you made me think about some of the things we can do to improve authorship climate. One thing I just wanted to acknowledge with the sharing, like open lab notebooks and so on. Of course, the worry that often comes up from scientists is, well, I'm afraid that we'll be scooped if we're doing really, impressive cutting edge work and some other lab knows we're doing it, then they'll quick try to publish before us. And there are some interesting examples of that. But we actually did some surveys of these environmental scientists asking what the key barriers were to making their data openly available. And the top point they made was actually the time involved in doing it, that actually being scooped was kind of ranked lower down. They felt like they didn't have the money and the time to take all this data they were working with and make it openly available. I think that as funding agencies require this, they're going to have to provide the funding to do it. But it is worth keeping that in mind as another danger I didn't mention. So I could say more, but were there particular figures, since I've got them up, that you'd be curious to talk more about? Is there anything I wanted to be sure to give you a chance if there was more you wanted to say about any of that? No, you're good. Yeah, I think those were some of the key points, but it's fun to hear about the work. It sounds like you've got some pretty a positive climate in your lab group, so that's really great to hear.
One more question, then we have the round of virtual questions, and then more questions again. Do you want to do the virtual questions? Okay.
Thanks very much for coming all the way from Michigan. It's 110 probably or something.
No, it's really a treat. And I was here in South America for another conference as well. So I didn't burn all that, make such a horrible contribution to climate change.
So your speech brought up 3 topics for me, which I'll chunk out, and just feel free to say what comes up for you, even if it's nothing. But the first thing is, are you aware of implementation science? Yeah. So I'll give you a case here in Brazil. I work with innovation here in Brazil, where there's a very famous hospital here that applied for funds to actually set up a health research lab in a shantytown with professional scientists from the university. Instead of being in the university studying reality, they had to be in reality, studying reality. And their team of colleagues were practitioners. So what they really wanted to do was, from a scientific point of view, cut that gap down between what ultimately scientific discovery is about, which is improving the human experience, to actually having implementation doing that. So that seems to speak quite nicely to both of your two topics, which is not just diversity of race, color, sexual orientation, but diversity of why are we doing this? How is this going to be useful? And then the open science part, getting the people that this will affect directly involved in the discovery and practice. So I'm wondering what comes up for you around implementation science. That's just the first thing that came up, just to show you how rich your topic was. I actually had three.
Well,
so
thank you. Yeah, maybe I can address that first, and then we can move on to your others. So yeah, I know of implementation science. I don't feel like I know it super well, so it would be really fun to hear more if you recommend certain things for me to look at.
There's a journal called Implementation Science you might start.
Yeah. I've also been I'm forgetting the term for it, but some of my interests in science communication, and also connects up with some of these issues of like science translation, this kind of work. So I really need to look more at that literature, so I'm not just reinventing the wheel as a philosopher. But what I love, I think your point connects really nicely with my interests in citizen science and community-based research, like finding ways to kind of close that gap between the actual people on the ground and the researchers. And it seems like implementation science may be one way to help do that. And partly because, back to my emphasis on values in science, once we realize that there are all these choices to be made that the scientists often aren't even recognizing. Like, they just think, well, obviously, this is the question we should be asking. This is what we standardly ask in our discipline. And then realizing, once we're actually working with people on the ground, it's kind of a different kind of question that's more significant. There's a great example of a professor, Luz Claudio, who's an environmental health researcher at Mount Sinai Medical School in New York City, where it was when she was on the ground talking with community members, they kept saying, we're really worried about asthma. And it hadn't even been on her radar screen. And she said, well, maybe we should start looking at this. And it ended up generating this hugely fruitful research project where she found these incredible correlations between asthma rates in different zip codes and income in those zip codes and race. And so like she shows these maps of New York City where it's just like almost a perfect correlation of massive differences in asthma rates in different areas that look exactly like the maps of income and race and so on. And so it's just been very influential on sort of calling then for changes to, the pollution that's contributing to this and so on. And that's just one example. But then, thinking, there may be different ways of analyzing the data to make it more relevant on the ground, or different ways of presenting the results to make it more relevant. And so I'm super interested in how these value-laden choices can potentially be made differently once you have that connection. So sounds like, it would be really fruitful for me to look at more.
You'd almost think that you could strip away some of the value debate when you're just looking at implementation science. How does this help someone's life?
Yeah.
Because if a person is sick, the value is we want them better. And that's pretty much something we can all get around, whether whatever our political, So the second one is, so I'm a physicist, and I also did philosophy as a minor, but I ended up migrating over into business innovation. And so if we think that one of the overall objectives of the process of science is creating a richer set of alternatives from which we can choose from, so commonly called divergence, which goes along with both of your topics. But having a richer set of alternatives or options in itself is not an asset unless you can make a better choice with that richer set of options. And a lot of the cognitive behavioral studies I've done around innovation is that at the front end, what they call the fuzzy front end, where you're creating these alternatives, it's better to have a much richer set of diversity. But at the choice end, it's worse. And so it comes back to what the gentleman here said, which is, how do you choose between the richness of an alternative where an Indian says, I need to have a dream to have the insight, right? Versus I need to see the evidence, right? And so if this way of thinking that you need richer diversity to create the alternatives, but you need the experts or the people that actually know what they're going to do with that, which means less diversity on the choice, it really not only means a choice about where you apply different approaches, but when, in what part of the process.
Yeah. No.
So I'm wondering if anything comes up with you about that, because we often talk about, which is better in which circumstance. Well, it's not the circumstance; it's where you are in the process.
No.
Are there parts of the process when diversity presents a obstacle?
Oh, that's such a great question, and I don't think I have as many insights on that. But I will say, again, the psychologist that I was working with on that project, Isis Settles, is very sensitive to the idea that whenever we're writing our papers, she always wants to highlight that diversity can present both benefits and challenges. And so part of studying diversity well is to better understand, under what conditions it can be most helpful, even in those cases where you may feel like you need to close down a little bit the diversity. Are there ways to kind of close down the decision space a bit while still having some openness or recognition that there are these other perspectives? So I just think that's a really fruitful area for us to think about, and I fear that I don't have the answers, but I think that's a great point. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I wasn't really expecting answers. Just throwing out questions to your one. To me, a good presentation is one that creates questions.
Yeah, thank you.
And
so I hope maybe I'll have more thoughts on your third point.
Well, the third point is kind of crosses over to the history of science, but I think it also talks about our future and what I think all of us consider an increasing polarized world. Which is, if you look at what is considered one of the most successful geographic places where science has had impact, it's the former orchard fields of Palo Alto and the surroundings. Today we call the Silicon Valley, where in 1946 the Nobel Prize winning scientist who invented the transistor moved out to the orchard tree, Dr. Shockley, to take care of his sick dad and brought his team with him. Today, 18 of the 25 highest valued companies in the world were born there in an orchard tree, right? And when you look at that culture, they always say, oh, it's a culture of exactly what you've been talking about, diversity and innovation. It's the fruits and nuts of California. It's this and that. But if you actually go back in history, the elements of that diversity and innovation were there, not by any plan or politic, but by a couple of really fundamental reasons, one of which it was the black sheep of the United States. Innovation and technology and science happened on the East Coast, and the West Coast was for fruits and nuts. And you had a base group of ham radio amateurs in the 20s and 30s that were experimenting with the spectrum that the FCC didn't regulate. They gave all the good spectrum to the East Coast firms like RCA and Zenith and Magnavox. And they left the high frequency spectrum to the amateurs because they didn't think it was useful. And they figured out that it would bounce back from a ship and you could make transistor tubes that were adequate for radars. And when these group of ham radio amateurs started sharing their information, even though they each wanted to have their own success, you created that seed of information sharing, and that carried over to Fairchild, which was the first really successful Silicon Valley company, where competitors, I hate you because you love Bolsonaro, I hate you because you love Lula. Well, let's sit down and have a beer. What can we agree on? And these competitors that worked at different companies began sharing what is top secret information between them, which today would be illegal. Today you couldn't do this because they knew in a couple of years they'd be working for this guy or for that guy. And so you created this culture of covert sharing that doesn't exist today, and that's going to get worse with artificial intelligence and with intellectual property rights, etc. Then you fast forward that to World War II, where you have a convergence around a single mission, which is to win the war. And then you have obviously one of the most important projects of all time in terms of science sharing, which was the ARPANET. ARPA, who doesn't know it, it was the Advanced Research Project Agency set up by the President of the US to make researchers share, and they created the first internet. Why? Not because they wanted to share, not because they wanted to be open, not because they give a damn about diversity, but because they wanted to contribute to the war. So I bring up polarization, and I bring up covert, illegal information sharing, and then I put it into context of what our kids will be sharing covertly or what they'll be getting around with, even though they love or hate Trump or love or hate Biden or whatever.
Well, so
sorry to extend on, but it's your speech was inspiring to make me think about some of these issues more deeply.
So lots there. One thing I'll just sort of pull out of that is it raises the question of, how can we best promote, innovation or scientific advancement? And there are a lot of interesting questions over, sort of, I think, opportunities for kind of engaged philosophy of science around these issues of science funding. And I would really recommend, actually, there's an online video by Heather Douglas, who I mentioned. She gave a talk at the University of Pittsburgh on Heather Douglas, on different approaches to science funding. And I found it fascinating, where she basically, discusses, different kinds of goals for research. Like some of it we may want more theoretical work, then we may have some more applied work. We may have kind of, sort of wanting to help foster industrial advancement. We may have military research, like you were mentioning. We may have work just sort of from a community perspective, trying to address public issues. And she kind of explores that maybe we need different models for promoting these different areas of research. So actually, I just forgot. Back to the very first comment when we were talking about lotteries. She says maybe for some of this you might actually use a lottery for part of the decision making, but maybe you don't want to do that for other areas. And maybe with some areas, say you're trying to meet community needs, well, maybe then you actually, like back to the implementation science, maybe you need the affected communities to be more involved in deciding what you're going to fund. And so I've really enjoyed talking about some of these ideas in classes about sort of the philosophy of science funding, actually, and there's been interesting work on maybe the distinction between basic and applied research is too simple. We need a much more complex account. And on the point about polarization, there's a lot of I think interest among philosophers of science right now in sort of how to address polarization, especially when that can foster like misinformation or disinformation, or like how to communicate across these divides if scientists are trying to communicate with those who don't trust them. And I think I really like what you were kind of getting at was like developing relationships. It's much easier to vilify people when you can just say that's the other, I don't interact with them, they're the enemy, versus there's a lot of discussion in the US that when the politicians actually brought their families to Washington, D.C. with them, and they actually interacted as families, they tended to actually have more fruitful political discussions because they realized, okay, this is a person, they have a family, they can't be all bad. Whereas, once they left their families back at home and it was just the politicians that came, then they're just like, I don't want anything to do with these other people. So, but I think it applies to scientists as well that, there's a great book by a philosopher, Maya Goldenberg, on vaccine hesitancy. And she says that rather than just regarding people who are vaccine hesitant as just like, stupid, obnoxious enemies, like trying to understand more of like why they're coming from that perspective. And again, when they still have to say in some cases, okay, from a public policy perspective, it's better to, do things our way, but trying to sort of reach out and sort of address people's concerns as potentially legitimate. And maybe back to your point, Pablo, recognizing even if we say, look, from our scientific perspective, we're not sure that we find the dream approach to be really reliable, at least understanding where people are coming from and having a conversation and comparing these different approaches, and that seems much more effective than just shutting down conversation. So anyway, thanks for the fruitful comments.
Yeah, I think that the third question that you put is more about closed science.
What science? Sorry.
Closed science.
Oh, closed science. Interesting. Yes.
The patents, the intellectual rights, and and you cannot circulate, communicate the data openly. Yes. You have interdictions about this.
Yes.
And so I think it's the limit, and we have to,
yes. I really appreciate that point.
I think that it's on the limit, no?
Yeah. And maybe just a couple thoughts on that. So one is, and I kind of just touched on this really quickly when I mentioned that we're typically talking about publicly funded science with open science, but we really, if we want to be engaged with key issues, we need to think, what do we do about all this privately funded science? And it's very relevant. A lot of my case studies involve environmental health research, where the companies are doing most of the studies that inform the regulators, about policy, and so it's a big problem if you force all the publicly funded scientists to provide their data, so then the companies can critically, sort of nitpick stuff. But then if their data isn't available, it's a real asymmetry. And so I think we need to think about that. There's Peter Gallison, a famous historian and philosopher of physics, has written some work on classified science, all the military science, just the vast hordes of information. I had no idea that's all classified, that we don't have access to, and the ways in which that it also relates to some really fruitful work in science and technology studies on the concept of undone science, the science that would be really valuable but isn't actually done, and or it may have been done and it's classified and we don't know about it. So yes, there's so many fruitful questions about, like the opposite of open science, and how do we address that? Yeah, closed science. Thank you.
So now we have some round of questions from the internet.
Okay,
and
cool.
So if you are watching virtually, you can ask Kevin by email. You just have to write to earesponde@usp.br. Okay. So the first question is from Jerusa Araújo. She's asking a general question. So, hi guys, I have a question for Kevin that's happening right now. What's the main question in philosophy of science nowadays? And she said, thank you. And I guess also you can talk in values in science. What do you think is the main question?
Yeah,
Values in
okay.
science and philosophy of science.
Yeah. Well, so I may not be the most qualified to say like what is, across all philosophy of science the main questions. But I really appreciate your question. I can just sort of point to, I think there's a lot of interesting work focused in specific areas of science nowadays. So, philosophers of biology looking at issues related to, like classic questions have been like the nature of the gene or units of selection, but looking at specific issues in those areas, in areas of philosophy of physics, clarifying concepts and so on. There's been a real upsurge of interest in philosophical issues related to climate science, because of the issues that we're facing there. So, just fascinating work. And this starts to connect with my values and science interests. Looking at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, looking at their reports and like sort of examining how the science kind of gets distilled into these reports, how they present the findings, what makes it into the really prominent executive summaries and what gets buried. And I mentioned openness about deliberations. How much do we know about the deliberations that go into these kinds of reports? So there's a lot of interesting work like that. And then I've just found it fascinating over the course of my career, the past 20, 25 years, the rise in interest in more values-related things, issues even related to race and science, gender and science, these roles of science and policy. When I first started, there might be, a paper here and there on these topics at the Philosophy of Science Association meeting, but much more of it was just these theoretical, technical issues. So it's super fun now when I go to the meeting. It's just like I can't choose between all the different talks in these areas. So I think it's again much more engaged with contemporary social issues, which is kind of cool to see. And then of course there's still cool stuff related to like the nature of understanding or the nature of modeling in science. What makes for good models. And so on. So that's just the field as a whole. In terms of values in science, I think that some of I mentioned one of the big questions is if we now tend to reject the value-free ideal, the idea that values should just be kept out of science. If we say, look, it's more complicated than that, you can't just exclude values from scientific work. Well, then how do we decide? Back to your question, what are appropriate influences of values? How do we manage these values? Do we strive for transparency? Do we try to pick the right values? Do we try to have the right diversity within the scientific community to sort of highlight the presence of values and hash out which values are most appropriate? Do we use an ethical approach for deciding these issues, or more of a political approach where we just try to have an appropriate procedure for handling these things? So I think those are some of the hot issues in values in science specifically, and then connecting to specific areas or fields of science, looking at how values are affecting particular cases and so on. So thank you for the question.
Nice. And now we have questions from Daniel Luis da Silva, who is affiliated with the Department of Psychology of a Federal University.
Okay.
And he has 3 questions. So first, whether your slides will be available, because he couldn't see some information and he would like to see the details.
Okay. I think that I could make them available. I just need to check with the typical practice. I guess it wouldn't be very cool talking about open science to then not make my slides available. So I should probably practice what I preach. And my understanding is that also the video will be available, so then people could look at the slides on the video. But I think I could also make the slides available.
He could get in contact with you by mail.
Certainly, yes. So if you just Google me, Kevin Elliott, Michigan State University, you'll find me. Also, my email address is really simple. It's my initials, KCE@msu.edu. So yeah, happy to get emails from anybody.
Perfect. And do you have some suggestions of for papers that have been produced in the field of psychology about the limits of open science. So do you have some suggestions about the literature?
Yeah, oh,
on
that's such a
psychology
good
and open
question.
science?
So in terms of the limits, I'm not as familiar in psychology. I know in terms of like the proponents of it, the person I immediately think of is Brian Nosek, Nosek, who's this very prominent psychologist at the University of Virginia who has this center on open science. In terms of the like sort of the weaknesses or drawbacks, I'm not as sure, although I'm sure there must be some discussions within that field. I'm more familiar with sort of the philosophers talking about the limits, and I raised some of them in my talk. Again, I would recommend this philosopher Sabina Leonelli, Leonelli, who's done very prominent work in the European Union on open science. She's very engaged, plugged in with all the major organizations doing this work, and her research group is writing all kinds of interesting stuff about the pros and cons of open science.
Nice. And finally, he would like to know whether you believe that open science can be an effective step to the democratization of knowledge, especially in poor countries such as some countries in South America and Africa.
Great question. So I think there I'd want to talk about again, different forms of open science. And I think that, forms that are really moving toward like community engagement or some of this like implementation science we were hearing about earlier, I'm probably most optimistic that can sort of help with democratization of science. Maybe I can, put in an advertisement that, I'm excited Pedro is starting to, sort of think about, community citizen science projects and so on. I feel like this is a really fruitful topic to think about the ways in which we can sort of bring science more in contact with people and their the issues they're facing, whether it be, again, the environmental health issues that I'm really interested in. As communities can get connected with researchers, I think really cool things can often happen. So that would be the kind of democratization that I would be kind of excited about. There's a great example, a sociologist, Phil Brown. People might want to look at his work. He's done all kinds of great work, but he started early on studying this group in this town of Woburn, Massachusetts, where they were suspicious, the community members, about like a cancer cluster in their area. And they wondered, could this be related to the drinking water? They felt like the drinking water was traditionally kind of nasty. It didn't taste very good. And they went to the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and they looked and said, things seem okay. These clusters just happen naturally sometimes. And then these residents, they kept persisting. They contacted some researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health, and then they worked with these researchers, and the community members helped to do surveys of the community to collect more information. And so again, what's cool is it brings the expertise of these experts together with the local knowledge of the community. And so you can benefit from, the statistical sophistication, methodological sophistication of the experts, with this community involvement. And anyway, they ended up finding that it did appear that there might be an environmental link. And they ultimately found that there had been pollution of the water sources. If you all want to watch a fun movie, there's a movie, A Civil Action, with John Travolta, where playing this lawyer examining this case. But there are so many cool cases like that that kind of make me excited about then the community members actually build up their. It's not just that they can contribute to the knowledge, but they're empowered in terms of having more capacity to then address other issues in their communities and so on. And so I think I'm just very excited about some of those possibilities. Sure, yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yes, that's a great question. It would be really interesting to look at that further. And I acknowledge, as I was talking about some of this authorship work, I was thinking, for those of you who are philosophers, you may feel like, this isn't too relevant. I mostly just publish my own articles. But I do think that there's kind of starting to be a move where I do see more dual author or 3 author publications in philosophy. And so I do think maybe we need to start thinking a little bit more about, how much does it mean? Sometimes I'm publishing with somebody else and we just use alphabetical ordering. And other times we put like my collaborations with David Resnick, then we tend to, whoever did more of the writing and the sort of drove the project will be first. And so just thinking, okay, what are our policies, and should we have authorship contribution statements saying, here's, the role that we played in these papers. So I guess one other thought is, I also, as I hinted earlier, I think that looking at like the professional climate of philosophy would be really interesting, because again, I just sort of have this sense, a lot of us in philosophy recognize that we've had problems with diversity, at least in the US. It was a very sort of white male dominated field, and thinking about sort of the climate, the ways in which what we think good philosophy looks like traditionally was kind of aggressive, focused on questioning, having these brilliant intuitions, and thinking about, does philosophy have to be done that way? Or can we think of it as being a much more sort of open enterprise where we're more interested in like sort of helping people improve their ideas versus, criticizing their ideas, taking them down? I think it's a really interesting question. And actually at the conference I was just at, somebody was giving a talk citing Kate Hundleby, Hundleby. So I haven't read a lot of her work, but it sounds like she's done some work on this idea of different ways of doing philosophy. To one example the speaker mentioned was, rather than sort of looking at like Descartes' argument for the existence of God and saying this is a terrible argument, and here's what's wrong and here's what's wrong, saying, what kinds of premises would be needed to actually make the argument work? And are there things that we can learn from this argument, whether or not we think it's successful? Or, so thinking about other ways of approaching these issues in ways that might make it a more welcoming community where a broader range of people feel comfortable. And I'll just mention personally, my first year of grad school, I sort of worried, did I choose the wrong field here? Because I was actually a chemistry major as an undergrad and then kind of added philosophy and was choosing which direction to go. And then when I got to grad school in philosophy, I realized this is scary. People are really sort of harsh with their questions, and that's not my style. And fortunately, I found a group of, area of philosophy of science, and I think the field has been changing. And then one last point, I guess, I'm blabbing away here again, is thinking about the topics that, again, we may have more trouble, having an open climate for a diverse range of people if we're just asking really theoretical questions about quantum mechanics or about the nature of scientific explanation. Again, not to criticize those areas, but it may be easier to bring a diverse range of people into the field if we're also asking really, engaged questions about, sort of how can, scientific research on race be done the most responsibly? Is it appropriate to use racial categories in medical research? Questions about, sort of how can we relate, scientific knowledge of various sorts to indigenous perspectives? Should we, regard this as indigenous science, other indigenous knowledge systems? How can we connect these together? That brings up really interesting issues for other people we may want to incorporate in philosophy. So, thanks. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the invitation.